Heard of Gilgamesh? Gilgamesh is an interesting character. He is a demigod and he wants to become immortal. And so really the Gilgamesh epic is a story about how he tries to go on this journey to try to secure immortality for himself. He wants to be like the gods. So we can gather in so people can make their way around us as well. And so the story of Gilgamesh is really an interesting, it's like a journey. It's like Star Wars, you know, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, there was a guy by the name of Gilgamesh. And we read about his exploits. And one of the exploits that he comes across is he hears about this guy who was given immortality. And his name was Utnapishtim. How many of you want to name your child Utnapishtim? Well, there was Utnapishtim. What happened was the gods one day, up in the pantheon, were sick and tired of the humans making too much noise on Earth. And so they wanted to wipe them all out. And so they decided to send a flood. Well, one of the gods liked Utnapishtim, and so he kind of serendipitously got word to Utnapishtim that a flood was coming. So build a boat, put your wife, put your family, put some animals on it, and then you will survive the flood. So it's really then very similar to what? The story of Noah and the flood. And so sometimes it's called, Utnapishtim is called the Babylonian Noah. And so here we have the story of this. It's on a number of tablets. Now these tablets they're written in typically Akkadian, and the types of tablets that we find are from the 7th century, but we know they basically come from earlier time frame, from much earlier the story was being passed down. But what Gilgamesh, though, when he heard from Utnapishtim that he got it that way, he realized he couldn't get immortality the same way that Utnapishtim got it. But he was told that if you go to this place far, far away, and you go to this lake, at the bottom of the lake there's a plant, it's kind of like seaweed, and if you eat this plant, you will become immortal. And so he took on this arduous journey, gets to this lake, he ties a stone to his legs and sinks to the bottom of the lake, gets this plant, makes it back up to the surface, swims to shore, and he's exhausted. He's just flat out tired. And so he's got this plant in his hand, but he falls asleep on the shore, and lo and behold, a snake comes and eats that plant. So all that hard work went for naught. But what's the point? What happens with a snake every year? It molts. And so this is kind of what we call an etiology. It kind of helps to explain why is it that snakes rejuvenate? Because it looks like they take on new skin every year. And so this is then kind of some of that background behind that. And so there is some similarities between Utnapishtim and the Babylonian Noah with the story of Noah. But once again, it's because the gods are capricious and all these kind of things. So we're going to talk about, again, the similarity between Babel versus Bible, between what the ancient Near Eastern culture says about things like law and creation, but also the Bible is unique in what it has to say. But I also want to talk about some of the other things you see in this gallery over here. One of the things besides writing, because not everybody could write, but everybody can have a seal commissioned. So just like I have an ID, all of you at Moody have an ID, so when you fob in, you're able to identify who you are. You don't have to write your name every time you walk into a building. It's kind of the same thing with a seal. So these are seals. Now they started out with stamp seals, but then they got the cylinder seals. So what you're seeing here, the rectangles, are the scene that is rolled out when you take one of these round cylindrical seals and you put it on wet clay or mud or whatever else. You can see the type of scene that's carved in. So every one of these seals is a unique signature stamp, as it were, for your identification. And so this is how you did business. This is how you conducted a transaction. So you used these cylinder seals. Now, when we come across the story in Genesis 37, we hear about Judah. And one of the things is when he's negotiating with Tamar to sleep with her on the side of the road, what happens? She says, well, what do you have to give me? Well, I'll give you a goat. Well, you don't have a goat with you, so what are you going to give as a pledge? what does Judah give as a pledge? He gives his staff, he gives his seal, and a cord. So just like I have a lanyard, that's the cord, and this would be the equivalent of a seal, and basically given over his whole identification. Credit card, ID, driver's license, he's yielding it out all over. And then of course we know the rest of the story when Tamar is found to be pregnant, and then she says, well, I'm pregnant by the guy who owns these things. And he was caught red-handed. And so a cylinder seal then plays a part of that storyline from Genesis chapter 37. So once again, we see reminders of the fact that these were ways that people did to identify who they were as part of a business transaction. All right, we're going to move over to, this is a replica. Oh no, actually we're going to go over here to the
yeah, they would either stand, press down, or they would roll out.
That go into that. And to give you an example of how common this was, or how big a part of the culture it was, in one city in ancient Mesopotamia, in Nippur, around 2000 BC, so roughly about the time of Abraham, in that one city there were over 100 temples. So just a very central part of their life and of their way of thinking. Now, temples were not gathering places for worship like you might think of a church, right? Coming into a sanctuary and worshiping together corporately. That's not what a temple was about. A temple was more like, think of like a royal residence, right? You have a king and a queen, they have servants, and they're sort of protected from the people, right? They're really important. That's kind of like what a temple was like. The gods, the images of the deities, the idols were at the very center of the temple. The priests were like the servants that took care of those images. They fed and clothed the gods. And the people would come and give offerings, but they wouldn't actually come in and worship in the temple. But let's say you were a pretty wealthy person and you wanted to make sure that the gods knew that you cared about them and really wanted that you were attentive to them. You could actually pay someone to create a statue kind of like this, a temple statue that would represent you as a worshiper that could be placed in a place where the deity would be able to see it. And you see how like their posture is very humble. And one of the other things that you notice about them is they've got really big eyes that are wide open, right? They're very attentive to what the deity wants to show them that, hey, we care about you, we worship you faithfully, so bless us, and that type of thing is what those are about. And this worship in temples and worship centered around an idol were so central to Mesopotamian life, it's hard for us to imagine what that's like. And I want to tell you just a really short story. I'll do it in an abbreviated way. I told this story to my class, so you guys get to hear this twice if you've heard it before. But in the year 1595 BC, there was the king of Babylon. His name was Samsu-Ditana. He was the 5th ruler, father to son, from Hammurabi. So 5th generation ruler. Life had been really stable for him. He could probably imagine life could never be different. He's the king, just like his great ancestor Hammurabi was king. In that year, though, a horde of, from his perspective, barbarians appeared outside the walls of Babylon. Totally unexpectedly. He didn't even have time to raise the army to fight these people. Well, who were these people? They were the ancient Hittites. King Mursili, they weren't barbarians, they had a very sophisticated culture as well, but they were 700 miles away, so they didn't even really hardly know about these people. They had surrounded Babylon. Babylon fell to them. And thankfully, Mursili was not into empire building. He wasn't trying to rule Babylon. He just wanted all their stuff. So they looted the city and took all their stuff back to the Hittite land. One of the things he took is he entered the temple of Marduk. Marduk was a patron deity of Babylon, the temple at Esagala. And he took the idol of Marduk and his consort and took them away, like kind of sent them into exile, back living in the Hittite land. Well, that created a crisis in Babylon because now Marduk was not there to legitimize the reign of the king. And as far as we know, for the next 100 years, Babylon as a city was just in turmoil. No, there was no real government because they had lost that kind of central heart of being able to have the God who can bless and support the reign of the king. Well, then this little group another group, the Kassites, came in and took over Babylon and adopted Babylonian culture, Babylonian languages, And one of the things the first Kassite ruler did, this was really shrewd, he made a deal with the Hittites and negotiated to get the idols back from the Hittite land. No one knows exactly how he did it, but they had a big celebration where they brought Marduk and his consort back into Babylon, and it ushered in a long era of Kassite rule, and because now the god is back to legitimize his rule. So that was kind of a good move on his part. It kind of gives you a little window into how important that was to ancient Mesopotamian life. And people also did give a lot of gifts to the gods. It's a lot of the things around here. They've changed this some since I was here last. You can see like a mace, jewelry, a lot of offerings people would give to the gods that were left there. Some of what is excavated in these sections here. So you can kind of take a look at that. And then we're going to head over and talk about Babylon. We're right here.
All right, so these are artist reproductions of the city of Babylon. So you can kind of see here, this is the Ishtar Gate. You can see here they have some temples and palaces and ziggurats and things, places that they're along the river. And so this is, again, a reminder that Babylon was this huge city, not just an empire, but a large city as well. And along the way, if you go to Berlin today, if you ever go to Germany and you can go to the city of Berlin, there's a museum there called the Pergamon Museum, and they have a reconstructed, or it is the Ishtar Gate, half of it is in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. So they took it away from Babylon and reconstructed it in Berlin at the museum there. But this would be one of the main 7 entrances in and out of the city. But this is one of the main ones. This was the Ishtar Gate. And of course, along the way is what this way is called the processional way. And so this was a parade route. And so especially during the New Year's festival, they would take their god and they would parade it out on a cart, and everybody would line the streets, and they would bring the idol, the temple, back into the temple, and everything would be reset for the new year. And so it was kind of a thing there. Along the processional way, there was 120 of these what are called striding lions. And so these are lions that were on the street level of the processional way that people would walk by as they made their way into Babylon. And what you're seeing on either side are 2 of the 120 striding lions. Now what's exciting about this is I can almost guarantee you that Daniel would have seen these same things, because he operated out of Babylon and would have been in and out of the Ishtar Gate, I'm sure, multiple times. So just as he made his way down the processional way in and out of the city of Babylon, and watching out of the side of his eye, or perhaps even glancing at them, 2 of these 120 lions are here at the Oriental Institute. Now lions are, of course, a very important image in the ancient world. They are the king of the jungle. They're the king of the wild animals. You have the eagle, which is the king of the birds, and then you have the bull, which is the king of the domesticated animals. And we're going to see evidence of how they combine some of those things in later images. But the lion was an important image for the king because it symbolized royalty. The king was often seen fighting lions and using lions in iconography. And so it's also quite interesting, though there's no correlation, that Daniel was in the lion's den. Now, of course, that was a means of capital punishment. That was a thing that they did there. But here's 2 of the 120 striding lions. And you can kind of see it's kind of like brick by number. They would have composed these bricks individually, and then when they erected them into the processional way, they just kind of put them in like a puzzle piece right in there. And so you can kind of see some of the glaze still today. It's still got a natural beauty to it today, but you can imagine what it was like in its prime. To just walk by these things with brightly glazed, with bright colors, and this just gives you a little bit of the glory and grandeur of the Babylonian Empire. Remember in the vision, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. And again, this was a magnificent kingdom that Babylon was the chief city of. But now we're going to turn to this replica.
Yeah, this unfortunately is not real. This is one of the replicas in the museum here. This is a replica of the Hammurabi Stele. And you can see this here, and that's one of the main jobs of a king in the ancient world was to administer justice. That was one of their main jobs. And some kings celebrated their ability to do so through the production of law codes, like we have here. This is probably the most famous law code from ancient Mesopotamia. It dates to, I put it down here, 1760 BC, so a couple hundred years before the time of Moses. you have this law code here. It's a law code of 228 laws. Hammurabi probably commissioned this after a defeat of Mari. To kind of celebrate that and to celebrate his rule, he had this thing made, and it pictures him. This is Hammurabi on this side of the register, coming before the sun god, the god of justice, Shamash. You can tell he's a god because he's got some like flared things coming up off his shoulders, and also the horns on his headdress. The more horns you have, the more elevated the deity, and so it's a very high-level deity, Shamash being the god that's concerned with justice, which makes some sense with the sun god, right? Because they can see everything happening in the world, so a god that cares about that. One of the reasons why this has, what kind of laws are on here? So there are things that relate to all the common areas of life. You can imagine why you need laws. Things like false testimony. What if someone kidnaps someone? What about, people who cheat you economically? Marriage laws. All of those kinds of things are on here. The things that relate to everyday life. And there are some notable parallels with laws that are in the Bible, within the law of Moses. And that kind of makes sense because they both are in a similar cultural context. They're going to have similar issues that they need to have laws to be able to regulate. So I'll just read a couple of them, some of the parallels, so you can kind of hear what that's like. For example, Exodus 21:15 says, "He who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death." So an adult child attacking their parents, they'd be put to death. Hammurabi Law 195 says, "If a child should strike his father, they shall cut off his hand." So different punishment, but very similar law there. Exodus 20:16 says, "He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death." Hammurabi Law 14 says, "If a man should kidnap the young child of another man, he shall be killed." So they have those kinds of similarities, right, where they deal with some of those issues. It's interesting to look at some of the differences too between the Code of Hammurabi and the biblical law. One main difference is the laws and punishments are pretty much the same for any Israelite, right? If you do this law, if you break the Sabbath, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, this is the punishment for that. One of the things, and I'd encourage you, if you have a chance to read through the Code of Hammurabi in English translation, it's available lots of places. Feel free to do that. One of the things that you'll notice is that the punishments and the laws are quite different. If you're an awilu, if you're an upper class person, life is a little bit better for you. You have a few more rights. If you're a mushkenu, which would be like a tenant farmer, not so good. And then if you're a wardu or a slave, it's really not good. So they have different laws and different punishments related to class distinction, essentially. Now, the Bible does address slavery some, but it doesn't have class distinctions in the same way that you have in Mesopotamia. One quick example on slavery that's kind of an interesting law is in Deuteronomy. There's this law that says, "You shall not give up to his master, a slave who has escaped from his master to you." In other words, if a slave runs away and he comes to you, don't give him back, which is strikingly different than any other ancient Mesopotamian law code. I mean, in fact, many treaties, especially between different countries, outline, hey, if a slave runs away, you better give him back, and things related to that. One other difference, and I think this is really worth pointing out, the law of Moses is not a monumental inscription like this is, right? It's a monumental inscription that's just a law code. What we have in the Pentateuch is a law code embedded within the narrative. It's within the story of what God has done, how he redeemed Israel out of slavery to Egypt, and then out of that entered into a covenant with his people, and out of faithfulness, out of gratitude for what God has done, out of faithfulness to the covenant, you obey the law that he's given. That covenantal context is very different, and also that narrative framework is very different as well. So there are really two different genres in a sense, a law code embedded in a narrative versus a monumental inscription like this. And of course the biggest difference would be that the Torah is explicitly said to be given from Moses by Yahweh. It's not Moses' law code, it's Yahweh's law code, whereas this is very much celebrating Hammurabi's law code. So when you break Hammurabi's law code, that's bad, because that's, violating the king. He's going to be upset about that. If you break the law code in the Pentateuch, this is a fundamental violation of your relationship with Yahweh. So very, very different in terms of who's giving it and what it's for, a covenantal context versus just how to live in an ordered society, which is what that would be about. So I'm sure it's probably something we've heard and read about. And they used to, when I was here, I was with the guy that actually flipped this thing, which you're not allowed to do, so I won't do it. but if you do, you can hear that it's hollow. It's just a,
Plastic.
it's just a, whereas the real one is a piece of solid granite. So, anyway. All right.
All right. You can kind of see off to my shoulder, there is a artist depiction of the palace of Khorsabad, or Dur-Shawurkin. Now let me set the scene. The year is 722 BC. What happened in 722 BC? The Assyrians conquered the 10 northern tribes. Shalmaneser was the king, but he died in 722, and it was most likely his military general who was the one who did most of the work in conquering the northern kingdom. Well, whenever a king dies, politics hates a vacuum. And so, we don't know all the story here, but Sargon becomes the next king. Sargon was a military leader, and that often happens. Whenever there's a vacuum in leadership, the military general takes over. It happened recently in Egypt, where Assisi took over. He was the general of the Egyptian army, and during the vacuum of the coup after the Muslim Brotherhood was dethroned, then the military general takes it. So this is a very common type of way for transition of government to take place. But he had to kind of defend himself. He called himself the true king. Well, if you have to say you're the true king, chances are there's a lot of propaganda that doesn't think you are the true king, and so you have to overemphasize that. Well, what he did was in 720 then, and he's now the ruler of Assyria, he now builds his own palace. The palace was at Nimrod, but he can't trust the people at Nimrod because they're all loyal to the previous kind of regimes. So he decides to build a new capital city, and what we're looking at are the remains of that capital city called Khorsabad or Dur-Shawurkin. It was about 12 miles away, not too far away, but far enough away where he could, in a sense, control access into his palace, into his city. It was about a mile square, and so what we're looking at are some of the remains from this palace. It took about 20 years for him to build, and then when he died, it literally went back under the sands of time. And so it was really only a place that wasn't used for very long, and during the time it was probably never fully occupied. And so this is his temporary palace because his son then took the palace to Nineveh, which we all have heard about as one of the cities of Assyria. But I want you to listen to a story that mentions Sargon, and that's in Isaiah chapter 20. So this is Isaiah chapter 20, and listen to what it says. In the year that Sargon, or the year that the supreme commander sent by Sargon, king of Syria, came to Ashdod. Now some of you remember in Life in Bible Times, you know where Ashdod is. That's one of the cities along the coast, one of the Philistine cities. So Sargon, king of Assyria, sent his supreme commander, his military guy, to Ashdod and attacked and captured it. Again, pretty common in the ancient world. They did a lot of ransacking and pillaging. At that time, the Lord spoke through Isaiah, son of Amos, and said to him, "Take off the sackcloth from your body and the sandals from your feet." And he did so, going around stripped and barefoot. Now, one of the things, Isaiah, you know, the prophet, and prophets are known for, in a sense, sign speaking in symbols and talking in symbols. And so Isaiah was told to strip naked, and I mean buck naked. So you think of this guy, this prophet Isaiah, and you think of him in a very dignified way because he's the one that writes the fifth gospel of Isaiah 53 and prophesies about Jesus the Messiah being born of a virgin, all these kind of things. This guy is naked. And not just for 1 hour, not just for one day, but wait till you see how long he went naked for. You couldn't get away with that in our student life guide at Moody, let me tell you that. Then the Lord said, "Just as my servant Isaiah has gone stripped and barefoot for," get it, 3 years. Isaiah buck naked for 3 years. I'll let that sink in. Why? As a sign and a portent against Egypt and Cush. Now here, one of the things you have to understand, if you're going to understand the world behind the text, you have to understand a little bit of a history. We already have Assyria, we already have Israel, we have Ashdod, again we have Assyria, Israel, Philistia, but we also now bring in Egypt and Cush. Well, remember, the Assyrians are the world superpower. Everyone wants to dethrone them. Why? Because they are imposing that every tribute nation, every nation under their vassalage, has to send them support, tribute. And who wants to send their own money to a foreign government? And so everyone is trying to buck off the chains, the shackles of the Assyrian Empire. And so what people are looking to do is build allies, alliances, to where if we come together, we can maybe thwart the Assyrian Empire. And so as a sign and a portent against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away stripped and barefoot the Egyptian captives and Cushite exiles, young and old, and this is what I mean by he was buck naked, with buttocks bare to Egypt's shame. So what Israel is thinking about doing is thinking of forming a military alliance with Egypt and Cush to try to, in a sense, counterbalance the Assyrian Empire. Isaiah goes around naked as a reminder not to trust in military alliances. And again, one of the themes we'll see here is Isaiah, really the whole book, one of the major themes of the book is, who are you going to trust? The nation of Israel, like other nations, wanted to trust in building military alliances, coalitions, to try to deal with the threat of the Assyrians. Isaiah goes around naked for 3 years. Why? To remind the people, hey, if you trust in Egypt and Cush, they're going to be paraded, and that's what happened. The Egyptian and Cushite mercenary soldiers were paraded, humiliated by walking naked through the streets. So that's why Isaiah goes around naked, to remind people, don't trust in military alliances. With buttocks bare to Egypt's shame. Those who trusted in Cush and boasted in Egypt will be afraid and put to shame. In that day, the people who live on this coast will say, see what happened to those that we relied on, those we fled to for help, for deliverance from the king of Assyria. How then can we escape? You can't. God's judgment is going to come, and you can't escape it, no matter how many military alliances you try to form. And so what we're looking at is basically the palace from which that supreme commander that went to Ashdod, and that at which Isaiah, it's because of Sargon and his political policies that Isaiah went naked for 3 years to remind people not to trust in military alliances, but to trust in God alone. And so let's talk a little bit more about some of the objects, and Dr. Cook is going to talk about the elephant in the room.
Yes, we have this really impressive statue here. This is the lamasu. And, oh yeah, we can see this. Does this work? There we go. This is the lamasu, and it, so what is this thing? Let's just talk about it a little bit. It has the head of a human, the body of an ox. It's got the wings of an eagle, and it's kind of like representing the kind of ultimate of every species, right? So the head of a human, it's a very intelligent creature. It's got the body of an ox, it's really strong and powerful. Wings of an eagle, it's really fast. And what this is this is a guardian deity. And you can tell it's a deity because of, see these 3 horns on the top? That is telling you that it's a pretty high up there deity, pretty powerful deity. We saw Shamash over there had 4 horns, so he's a little bit higher than this guy who's only got 3. And this is just an amazing technical achievement that they were able to make this thing, right? Let me give you just a couple of facts about this. It is 16 feet tall, it weighs 40 tons, and was carved out of a single stone. So just think of the just technical skill that it took to be able to carve this thing out, create it, ship it to this palace that's being built, and basically put it into place. It was a real challenge to get this thing here in the modern era, to be able to put this thing on a boat and get it all the way here. When they were building this institute, they actually kept this wall open because they knew it was coming, and they put the thing in and then built the wall behind it, which is how it got here. So really impressive.
Yeah, 2 men in a truck are not going to get this thing in here.
No, that's not going to do it. So what's the purpose of a lamasu? These things would be guarding the doorway. If you imagine you get an audience with the king. If you want to go into the king's throne room, you have to go through these kind of guardian deities on either side. This is all about awe. You want to impress the people who are coming, that you are going before a very powerful person who has a lot of protection. And you'll notice it has 5 legs. So if you look at it from the front, it looks like it's walking this way, but if you look at it from the side, face on, it looks like it's standing still. So it's kind of cool how they are able to affect perception of it by having 5 legs essentially instead of 4. A later Assyrian king talked about the purpose of the lamasu. He said was to turn back an evil person, to guard the steps, and to secure the path of the king who fashioned him. Now you'll notice if you look closely at the lamasu, like down here, see all this writing? And there's a bunch of writing here. And actually on the back of it, if you go around to the back, you can actually look, there's writing all over the back of this thing as well. And so you might be wondering, what's written on there? Well, most of what's written on there is basically all about Sargon's great deeds and accomplishments and all the amazing things he did and the temples he built and the victories that he achieved. It's a celebration of Sargon's rule. And this inscription ends with a line that says this: "The gods who dwell in this city have granted me the lasting gift of building this city and growing old here." Now, kind of as Jim talked about, that's kind of an ironic line at the end of this inscription because Sargon died in battle in 705 BC and was probably never able to even live in the palace. But the inscription talks about how he could grow old there, so it's kind of a little bit ironic in that way. But it does show you how sophisticated the culture of ancient Assyria was, and really their technical know-how and craftsmanship and how they were able to make really impressive statues like this. And as we'll see with the Assyrians, it's all about creating an impression, exuding power. You don't want to cross these people. And they say that in a lot of their propaganda and a lot of their just incredible decorative statues like this. And I think you're going to talk about some of the people here.
Yeah. So these are reliefs that would line the palace temple walls. And what you can see here, I know you can't really, but this is Sargon. So this is his palace that you're now walking around in. And one of the things you should have brought today, which you did, well, he gave me $5 for the entrance. But what these people are doing, look over here, what's he bringing? He's bringing horses. So basically, what this palace was not just the king's residence, but was also the place where he would receive guests and dignitaries. And when said guests and dignitaries would come, what should they have with them? All sorts of gifts, all sorts of goodies. And so here, the Assyrians were really good at perfecting the horse for warfare. So they really wanted a lot of horses. And so this is the guy bringing horses to King Sargon. And this guy back here, his head's lopped off. But he's either holding an umbrella to keep the king out of the sun, or some type of device to keep the bugs, fly swatter-like device. And of course, he's receiving all of these gifts from here. So this is Sargon. But let me introduce you to his son. His son is over here. He is the crown prince. So this guy is the crown prince. And so this is, and you know his name from the scriptures, Sennacherib. So he's going to be the next Assyrian ruler. But so he's the son of Sargon, and he's now the heir apparent to the Assyrian Empire. And one of the things you notice is, of course, he has some of the accoutrements. He's got the lotus wristwatch. He's got the sash that identifies him, because these other guys don't have the, well, this guy has a lotus wristwatch, I'll come back to him, but these 4 guys back here are what we call, well, let me see if you know, puffy cheeks, no facial hair. This guy's got facial hair. What are these guys over here? These are eunuchs. These guys are snipped. Okay? Why is that important? Well, if you're serving the king, you have no other loyalties other than to the king himself. And also, too, if you're anywhere near the harem, you don't have any issues with fiddling around with the harem. And so, eunuchs were very, very important in the ancient world because they served the king and they were at his beck and call 24/7. And so these guys are part of the attendants. They would also be sometimes very militarily trained to protect and guard the king during any potential threats. And so they were very important to the official court. And so they're also kind of setting the tone. Hush, hush, kind of hold up, don't rush in here. Make sure you come with the right decorum. So here is Sennacherib. So he's the one that is going to be the next ruler of the Assyrian Empire. And notice, he's got the beard. These other guys are eunuchs over here. This guy has the lotus wristwatch. These guys don't. This guy has a sash. This is when, I'm dating myself, there was a radio program called Paul Harvey, and he would give the rest of the news. I wish we had Paul Harvey still around today to give us the rest of the news regarding this guy right here. because there's a little bit of intrigue in terms of art historians as to what's going on with this guy. Because if you look right here, what's happening right here? What was here at one point? These guys don't have beards, but this guy had one of these chin beards here. All right? He also has a lotus wristwatch. He also had the sash. These guys don't have the sash. So we don't know if the guy made a mistake and said, scratch off the beard, scratch off the thing. Well, keep the lotus wristwatch. Maybe nobody will notice. But maybe he was a crown prince that defended Dad and was taken out of the right of rulership. Who knows? But again, it's part of the story over there. But I also want you to notice that this is, what you see here is still very, very beautiful in terms of the artistry. But you can kind of see every once in a while little colors. This would have been full color. This would not have been just stone. These would have been painted with blues and yellows and reds and all sorts of colors. Now we have to remind ourselves that life in the ancient world was pretty dull. Getting really magnificent blues and reds and colorful clothes was very, very expensive. And so this would be like walking into a 3D IMAX presentation if you were a member of the ancient world. Coming into the palace, seeing everything like this in full kind of surround sound and seeing the beauty. And so this would have been overwhelming to your senses if you ever had the opportunity to come into the king's palace. But I want to briefly talk about these eunuchs for a little bit. Puffy cheeks, no facial hair. I talked earlier about Isaiah. Let me also give another incident from Isaiah, a little bit later on in the book of Isaiah, chapter 39. Isaiah comes to Hezekiah. Hezekiah earlier had trusted the Lord, but now we're going to see that Hezekiah failed in another lesson about trusting the Lord. And so in Isaiah chapter 39, Hezekiah had gotten an illness and recovered. So he got 15 more years of life. And so now, at that time, Merodach-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent Hezekiah letters and a gift. Now remember, the Assyrians are still the mighty superpower. Babylon is kind of like Egypt and Cush. They're like potential allies that we could form alliances with. And so Merodach-Baladan sent Hezekiah letters, a gift, because he heard of his illness and recovery. Hezekiah received the envoys gladly and showed them what was in his storehouses, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine oil, his entire armory, everything found among his treasures. There was nothing in his palace or in his kingdom that Hezekiah did not show them. What's Hezekiah up to here? He's showing these Babylonian kind of ambassadors everything that he owns. Why is he doing so? He wants to say, hey, if we form a league, alliance, look what I have to bring into this alliance. I have a lot of gold. I have a lot of things that can help us if we try to forward against the Assyrian Empire. Then Hezekiah the prophet went to King Hezekiah and asked, what did these men say and where did they come from? From a distant land, Hezekiah replied, they came to me from Babylon. The prophet asked, what did they see in your palace? Hezekiah responded, they saw everything in my palace. There is nothing among my treasures that I did not show them. Now listen to what Isaiah says next. Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord Almighty. The time will come when everything in your palace, all that your fathers have stored up to this day, will be carried off to Babylon. So what you think is pretty good right now, you're going to lose it all. It's going to be carted off to Babylon. So you think now you're pretty proud about your storehouses? You're pretty proud of your bank account? It's going to be gone. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away. But listen to what it says next. And they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So some of Hezekiah's own offspring, the royal seed, is going to be carted off to Babylon and made eunuchs there. Let me ask you, who do we know that serves in the palace of the king of Babylon later on? Daniel and his 3 friends. I would like for you to possibly at least entertain the notion that Daniel and his 3 friends were eunuchs. Do you ever hear about Daniel's wife or family? What are they doing? They're being trained to serve in the court, just like these guys are. That's what Daniel was trained to do in Babylon, was to serve the king. And it's really again, one of the sad reminders of Hezekiah being proud, not trusting the Lord, not trusting in military alliances, not trusting in his gold, but he did, and he's going to lose it all, and he's going to lose the heritage of his own family. And that's a sad reminder of what consequences we have for not trusting the Lord. And so every time I'm in this room, I think about Daniel, and I think about the consequences of not trusting the Lord. All right, we want to move on to the next room.
Tucked back in the corner here. But as you're coming through, you can see like these reliefs that Dr. Coakley was just talking about. They're also on the other side. There's more of them there. Those are the Assyrian, what's called the Assyrian Annals. And you will read about those sometimes in like a Life in Bible Times in your textbooks or things like that. They're one of the main sources for Assyrian history that we know about. Now, they weren't written just to give history. They were really getting to, celebrate the king and all the great things that the different Assyrian kings accomplished is what those annals were about. In fact, it's kind of interesting to think about when you look at all the Assyrian annals, guess how many battles the Assyrian kings lost? 0. You don't record defeats. But it is a good place where you can see, like you can line up things historically that happened because of that. Now this artifact here is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. And this is actually a replica. This is a really, one of the most important artifacts related to, Old Testament history. The original is in the British Museum, but this is a great replica, so we can talk about it here. And what you have on this replica is the oldest visual depiction of an Israelite. So, and he is in the second, there's 5, relief windows here. In the second relief window, there is the Israelite king, Jehu. You guys know Jehu? He is pictured in a very triumphalistic pose here with his face on the ground, bowing before Shalmaneser III. And so it's kind of interesting, the first visual depiction we get of an Israelite is with his face on the ground, right, bowing before this Assyrian king. And the inscription below it here reads, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri. I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with a pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, tin, a staff for a king, and spears." So just a reminder that even though Israel was not being governed by the Assyrians at this time, they were giving tribute to the Assyrians and were like a vassal state of the Assyrians. And you can see Jehu right there paying homage to Shalmaneser. So this is one of the great places where there's what you call convergence between archaeological evidence and what the biblical story recounts as well. And probably one of the most famous areas of convergence that demonstrate that. So it's a little bit about the black obelisk. Now there's another important artifact here that's not a replica.
All right. Yeah, this to me is one of the top 10 archaeological pieces anywhere in the world related to the Bible. And we have one right here in Chicago, right here in our backyard, and most people aren't even aware of it, and you kind of easily just pass by this. This is what we call a Sennacherib prism or Sennacherib cylinder. It's a 6-sided clay prism that's etched with cuneiform on 6 of its sides. And it's basically a record of Sennacherib's military exploits. We just met Sennacherib in the previous room. And so on this prism is a recording, really propaganda, of all of his military exploits, his campaigns to add more territory and more tribute for the Assyrian Empire. But what is significant about this particular piece? This piece mentions Hezekiah by name 3 times. So it's one of the things that we can help to correlate Assyrian timeline with biblical timeline. And so once we get to the Syrian Empire, basically all scholars around the world say the Bible is spot on in terms of its chronology and timeline. Why? Because the Assyrians mention the same people that the Bible mentions. Sennacherib and Hezekiah are mentioned both in the Hebrew Bible, but also in the Assyrian records. And so prior to that is when the scholars get all, debate about did David exist and all those other things. But because of evidence like this, it's undeniable that a man by the name of Hezekiah actually existed. All right? And so it mentions 3 times. Now, here's what it says on there. As for Hezekiah, the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities and surrounding smaller towns, which were without number, using packed out rams and applying battering rams, infantry attacks, I conquered them. I took out 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep without number, and counted them as spoil. He himself, and this is the famous line, I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. The Assyrian army had surrounded Jerusalem, and Hezekiah was like a bird in a cage. He couldn't get out. But what's very interesting is that even though he says he captured 46 of Judean cities, the text does not tell us what? That he conquered Jerusalem. Why? Well, we have to go to the Bible. What does the Bible say in Kings? That 185,000 Assyrian soldiers lost their lives one night. Oh, just a little number. He talked about carrying out 200,000, but he doesn't mention that he lost 185,000 of his own soldiers. So again, this is typical, just like Ryan said, no Assyrian king ever loses a battle. And so the guy who records this doesn't want to put any bad, negative kind of light about the Assyrian ruler. And so we leave out those kind of significant pieces of detail, and we only share what we want to share. But what is very, very helpful for us is that this piece actually helps us to correlate to Bible and correlates the Hezekiah with Sennacherib, and we have evidence of it on a piece of clay that helps us to be reminded once again the Bible is accurate in terms of its historical record. You notice on either side we have these two sergeant at arms. They only have two little quirls at the top. So just like your military, you don't have one stripes, two stripes. These are sergeants, not generals or colonels or whatever else. So these are part of them. We've seen these kind of figures before, some of them in that first gallery, where you see figurines. Now, these aren't necessarily what we think about when we read the book of Genesis, but I think it would be very similar. Remember the story of Jacob and Laban and Rebekah and the household gods that Rebekah stole? So these would be probably very similar to the type of gods that an actual household would have. So these would be perhaps similar to the teraphim that are mentioned in the book of Genesis that Rebekah stole from her dad. Why? Because she probably still had some superstitious and some pagan type of notions. But once again, we can see, as we talked about earlier, accentuation upon human genitalia, breasts and male and female genitalia. And so it's again a reminder of fertility being a very, very important thing. And so this is again part of the culture everyone had, or very much was in tune with these kind of idols, even in the house, not just in the temples. But Ryan's going to show us something that...
Come over this way. So we are in the area dealing with Syria, Anatolia, so this would be the land of the ancient Hittites. But they also had run-ins with the Assyrians, and so there are some depictions of Assyrian soldiers in reliefs that come from ancient Syria, Anatolia. And I want to talk about this for just a minute. The Assyrians were masters at propaganda, and of course they used it because they wanted nations to capitulate to them and not fight. And so they wanted to give people motivations to just surrender instead of fighting. And one of the ways they did that is they projected an image of violence, total defeat, total destruction, and they were able to sell that to terrify people. And so here's a slice, or one picture, I guess, of the Assyrian soldiers here who have just won a battle. And you can see the Assyrian soldiers here have that interesting cap, they're bearded, they've got a bow and arrow there that shows some of the weapons they used. But what does he have in his hand there? He's holding a decapitated head right by the hair, and he's standing on the dead bodies of his enemies. And you can see that, and the same thing happens with all of these soldiers as well, are carrying these human heads in their hands, just a way of saying, you better not cross Assyria, or that's going to be you. You're going to look just like that. We also, mentioned how the Assyrians in their annals never lose a battle. It's really interesting to think about the biblical historians. They're strikingly honest about Israel's history, aren't they? They lose battles all the time. Israel was terrible, they did this sort of thing. So it is one of those places where you see they're written for a very different purpose than these Assyrian texts. But that gives you sort of a picture of why the Assyrians were so feared. And maybe initially one of the reasons why, right, Jonah was afraid to go to Nineveh, perhaps. Although it turns out at the end of the book of Jonah, he really didn't want to go because he didn't want them to repent. But there's a connection there as well. So if you want to walk by, get a close-up look at some of those Assyrian soldiers, and then we are headed...
How many want to go to Israel?
Yeah.
Want to go to Israel? Let's go to Israel.
Israel.
I'll briefly set this up, but here we are in what is called the Megiddo Gallery. University of Chicago was involved with excavations at Megiddo. You know it as Armageddon. Armageddon comes from the Hebrew har, which means hill or mound, and Megiddo, which is the name of the city. And so Armageddon is the Greek form of Har Megiddo, or Armageddon. And so you can see here, this is a kind of a nice springtime. Most of the time when we go in May, June, it's very dry and very brown. But here it is very, very green and lush. It's in the overlooking the Jezreel Valley. And so this is a very, of course, famous area in the northern part of Israel. You can see it here on the map. And so University of Chicago was very instrumental in excavating there. And a lot of the pieces that we find here in this room are from the University of Chicago digs here at Megiddo.
Okay, you want to come back here?
Yes.
All right. We'll talk about more. I think Dr. Coogan's going to talk more about like the Baal and El over here in just a minute. But if you can take a look over here. I get to talk about all the fake artifacts in the museum. This is another replica of what's called the Moabite stone, or it's called the Mesha Stele, and those two names kind of represent well what this thing is. It's called the Moabite stone because it is written in the Moabite language. It's from the Moabite king. It's called the Mesha Stele because Mesha was the Moabite king who commissioned this thing to be erected. And just a quick story, I'm not going to tell all the detail, you can read about it online, but in the late 1800s, there was a missionary, essentially, who went into Jordan and saw this thing and knew, he didn't know what it was, but he knew it was really important and valuable. He took a plaster casting of it and, went back home and was trying to talk different governments into acquiring this artifact to be able to study historically. There's a long backstory with what's happening with that, but in the meantime, the people, the village that had this stone in it thought, boy, all these Westerners are interested in this stone, it must be really valuable. Maybe there's something valuable inside of it. And so they blew it up into pieces. And of course it turns out that's not what they really wanted. But thankfully, because there was a plaster casting taken of it, they were able to kind of reassemble it. But that's why it looks so cracked and jagged and kind of messed up now. But this stele, again, it's written in Moabite, which is a language very closely related to Hebrew. In fact, the script looks just like Paleo-Hebrew, which would have been very similar to the script the Bible was originally written in. So it's kind of cool to be able to see that. And it records events that are also recorded in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3, where it talks there about, it corroborates that biblical story, but also provides additional details that are not in the biblical account. So the Bible talks about how during the time of Omri and Ahab, Mesha had to pay tribute to Omri and Ahab. It was like a vassal state to them. And once Ahab died, he quit paying tribute, right? He wanted to throw off his Israelite overlords. And when he did that, that caused Israel and Judah to form an alliance and come against him to try to defeat him. And the Bible tells us in 2 Kings that as they kind of penned Mesha up in a town, the very cryptic line in 2 Kings says, well, the king then took his son and sacrificed him on the city wall. You guys remember this story? And then there's this line that says, there came a great wrath against Israel. Likely means that the city was spurred to defend itself in a renewed way, and they fought against the people of Israel and threw them off and defeated them. This stele records that victory against Israel, and it also records some additional victories of Mesha over Israel, which he attributes to his god Chemosh. So it's another place where there's this convergence between the biblical account and an ancient Near Eastern artifact. Two other really cool things are, this is the earliest artifact where the name Yahweh is written, because it talks about the God of the Israelites being Yahweh, and it's on line 18. I didn't look at this ahead of time. Let me see if I can remember where it's at. Here it is right here. There's their Yod, He, Vav, He, is the name Yahweh right there in the Mesha Stele. So that's the earliest written record. It's kind of interesting that it's, in an inscription from an enemy of Israel, where it exists, but that's where it is. And also, and this is more recently, the plaster casting that was originally taken was hard to read. There's a story behind that as well. But with new equipment, they were able to do some additional study of that original plaster casting. And down in line 31, they now are fairly certain that there's a reference to the house of David down here as well when it's talking about the Judean king that allied with the Israelite king to fight against Mesha, which would be another example of a historical reference to David, that there's a king in the line of the house of David. So really important artifact historically. This is the only text we have that's written in Moabite. So if you want to study Moabite, you can translate this, then you'll have translated everything in the Moabite language. So now let's go ahead and take a look at Baal and El.
All right,
up here. Yeah.
Just before we look at Baal and El, this is a four-horned altar. So this is found in Megiddo. This is not an animal sacrifice altar. This is an incense altar. But you kind of see the four horns. Remember the story about people grabbing the horns of the altar for protection. But that's a smaller example of a four-horned altar that would have also been used for. But I want you to gather around this case because here we see two of the Canaanite gods. We have the chief god El. He's in gold foil sitting. And then we have Baal, or Baal, the bronze one, right next to him. And he's often seen with his right arm extended, typically having a lightning bolt in his hand because he's the one who controls fertility and the weather. So here's gods that were found, excavated at Megiddo. So these are representation of the Canaanite gods that we read about in the Old Testament. Now, what's kind of interesting, of course, is a little bit of understanding about Canaanites versus Egyptians. Canaanites were what we might say evangelistic. Remember, they were part of the rain culture. Rain comes from who? From Baal, from Baal. How does rain come about? Well, when Baal is sexually active in the heavenly pantheon, one of the side benefits is rain comes. And so how do we then get Baal in the mood? Well, we have religious practices on earth that are virtual pornography for the gods. So that's why we do sacred prostitution. That's why we reenact sexual acts as part of the worship service. And so as to try to say, hey, Baal, think about what we're doing here. Do you want to do that up there? And as a result then, rain and fertility comes on the earth. And so you can see how deadly of a interposition of that between religion and immorality intertwined, how much that is so deadly for a culture. And why the Canaanites want everybody to get in on this. You want rain, I want rain, everybody wants rain. So we have to do whatever we can to bring rain. And so there's a lot of pressure put upon everybody who lives in Canaan, in Israel, to worship to bring rain. And so you can see why Jacob and family had to go to Egypt. Egypt is, what we might say, more racist. Remember Joseph, the story of Joseph. He could not even eat at the Egyptians' tables. So they shunned the foreigners. Where the Canaanites were, hey, the more the merrier. We need more people to worship and appease Baal so we all get rain. You want rain, right? And so they all come together. But now Israel goes down to Egypt and they're able to develop, in a sense, in a greenhouse, some not only critical mass, but also hopefully be able to have a little bit more spiritual muscle to be able to resist the Canaanite way of life once they get back in there, when they come back into the land of Israel. But also behind, you can kind of see some of the wealth of Megiddo. Megiddo is on the main trade route. It's part of the Via Maris. It's part of the main, it's a toll booth that people would have to pay tribute to as they would come in and out of this region, overlooking the Jezreel Valley on the way up to Damascus or even further to the Assyrian or the Babylonian Empire. But these are part of the remains that we find from Megiddo. What are they made out of? Ivory. Is ivory native to Israel? Where do you get ivory from? You get it from Africa, from the elfin tusks. And so what we're looking at here is very, very expensive pieces that would have to mean that you were very much involved in trade and art. And so you can see here, there's a game board here. This is called the game of 58 holes. It's kind of like, some type of, maybe like a parcheesi or some other type of game, cribbage or whatever, But that's solid gold and a sliver, a cross-section of an ivory tusk. So this is not your average Monopoly game you would have played with when you were young. This is expensive. This is the lap of luxury. You're also seeing here, these are chair backings. So this would be, the straps in the back of your chair you would have, or in your bed, you would have these kind of ivory inlays. Now Amos talks about it. We talk about the one percenters today. Well, listen to what we read in the book of Amos when he talks about the problem, folks, is not wealth. It's how you acquire it and how you use it. Listen to what Amos says in chapter 3 and verse 15. I will tear down the winter house along with the summer house. Well, that tells you these are one percenters. Why? They have two houses. They have a place in the summer and a place in the winter. The houses adorned with ivory will be destroyed, and their mansions will be demolished. And then in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 4, it talks about, you lie on beds inlaid with ivory, just like this, and lounge on your couches and dine on the choice lambs and fatted calves. And basically what Isaiah is doing is crying against those who acquired wealth on the backs of the poor. Why? Because you want to live in the lap of luxury. Megiddo often lived in the lap of luxury. So these are the people who Amos and the prophets are crying against, who abuse their positions of power in order to maintain and acquire wealth for themselves on the backs of the poor. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about something very important. That piece over here.
There's several things in this picture here that are worth pointing out. I'm sure almost all of you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? This is not the place to give a whole lecture on the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their importance to the study of the Bible. Just to say, in 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd found a cave, right, in a sandstone cliff. And upon investigation, there were, several caves there near Qumran that had lots of ancient manuscripts in them. All the manuscripts dated from about 200 BC to 70 AD. So that's what those manuscripts dated to. And there were 40,000 fragments of text that were discovered that all came from 800 different manuscripts in 11 different caves. So you have caves, manuscripts, right? All about 800 different manuscripts there. 170 of those manuscripts were biblical manuscripts, so copies of the Bible, different parts of the Bible. Every part of the Bible is represented except for the book of Esther, which could be just an accident of history, right? Some of the other books we have just a very small fragments of, and most of these Dead Sea Scrolls are in tiny pieces like you'll see here. There's a little piece of the Dead Sea Scroll here. That's not a biblical manuscript. The other manuscripts are things like, the community rule, things that how to organize themselves as a community. There's commentaries on the Bible, a commentary on Habakkuk, or commentary on the Psalms. There's different collections of scripture. So there's other intertestamental Jewish books that are represented in those as well. But really, one of the amazing things with it is before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest complete manuscript of the Old Testament in Hebrew dated to about 1000 AD. Now we found texts that date 1,000 years earlier that corroborate really the reliability of the Masoretic tradition, which is what we have in the New Testament. Most famously is the Great Isaiah Scroll. Almost the entire book of Isaiah was found in one single manuscript. It's really impressive find there. So you can take a look at this. Again, this is not a biblical scroll, but it's part of like a prayer or a psalm you can see there. The couple other things in this box that are interesting, box in this case, is an ossuary box, which is right here. An ossuary box is a bone box. And these are really important for the study, particularly of the time of Jesus. The Jewish people only used ossuaries during the Roman period, so if you find one of these, you can date it to a very narrow time frame. And what would happen is, someone would die, so they wrapped them in a shroud. They put them in a family tomb, think of like a cave type of tomb, and they let the body rot for, 2 or 3 years, something like that. And then they come in, and a body that's laying down prone in a cave takes up a lot of real estate. So you want to conserve space in a family tomb. So what you do is you collect the bones, you put them in a nice ossuary or a bone box, and put it on in a little niche in the cave. And so that's what these things were used for. And this has come into the study of the New Testament for a couple of different reasons. One of them is they found in one of these ossuaries, which again dates right to the Roman time period, a heel bone that had a nail through it, which actually gives evidence that the Romans did crucify people by using nails to pin their legs and their arms. Up to that time period, it was actually controversial. Did the Romans actually use nails like the Gospels portray Jesus being crucified? Well, then they actually found it in the bones. That's pretty helpful. The other thing that's helpful with these ossuaries is they are a great source of names. And I was looking I did put down the inscription that's on here. This Hebrew inscription here reads, this is Yoezer, the son of Yehonahan, the scribe. And that may not seem like a big deal to us that there's a bunch of names, but because they all date essentially to right around the time period of Jesus, it's a great source to create a database of names of Jewish people who lived in Israel around the time of Jesus. There's one scholar by the name of Richard Balcom took a lot of that information, as well as other places where there's evidence of names in the area of Israel during the time of Jesus, create a huge database of names so you know what are the most common names, where, how often do you see them, and he compared that with the Gospels and what names are used and what frequency, and found a really close match that the names in the Gospels actually line up really well with the names of first century Jewish people. And that would be the kind of thing that would be really hard to forge, if it's much later on. So just even in little ways like that, ossuaries can be helpful in the study of the Bible. So you can take a look there. There's a Dead Sea Scroll. You don't want to miss that, and then the ossuary there. And we're going to be heading from here into the Egyptian.
Let's go to Egypt. Let's go to Egypt.
It's the quickest trip to Egypt.
All right, we're not going to be able to spend a whole lot of time in this gallery, but I encourage you to come back either on your own or spend more time after our tour and walk through and visit a lot of these galleries. Of course, this is one of the most famous Egyptians of all. This is King Tut. The problem is he's probably one of the more insignificant kings. He died before even out of his teens. He died while he was still a teenager, and his tomb was hastily kind of erected and buried away in a small little place in the Valley of the Kings. But yet it made the headline news in the 1920s when Howard Carter discovered this tomb undisturbed. And so it really helped us to understand a little bit more about Egyptian, because most of the tombs, pyramids are just like a highway neon line saying, "Come rob me." And because tomb robbery was very, very prevalent in the ancient world. Why? Because people often would bury precious artifacts along with the dead. And so they would be a place for people to get jewels and gold and different things. So this is, again, a reminder of, even this piece was recommissioned by a later pharaoh. He apparently didn't have enough budget to commission his own, so he scratched off King Tut's name and put his own name. So again, this is reallocating resources. Okay, let's move. All right, there's a case over here that contains a burial. Not necessarily what we consider to be a mummy, but it's early on, and we can begin to see already that in the ancient Near East, as Ryan was talking about, death was very important. We want to prepare people for the afterlife. So you bury them with things like pots and foodstuffs, and even there's a gray palette in there. That's a cosmetic trait. You know how football players, baseball players wear eye black? Well, a lot of Egyptians would wear that, and so even the men would wear that. And so this would be, cosmetics would be something you want to look good in the afterlife. Over here we see stuff from the mummies. I helped one of my professors write his book on mummies when I was in grad school. A very fascinating study. The brain, they didn't have anything to do with. So they would go up to your nose and scrape it all out and just get rid of your brain. But pieces of your lungs and your stomach and other things would be placed in these canopic jars, and they would then hopefully be able to be of use to you in the next life. But I want to talk about this little papyrus up here. This is actually part of a longer papyrus. We call it affectionately the Book of the Dead. It's really the book of going out and coming in, because basically, in the afterlife, we want to be able to leave your body and come back to it, and have your ka and your ba, which is kind of like your spirit world, and how you do that. But I want you to notice what we have here is we have this depiction, and this is almost like a cartoon, a Sunday comic, where you're seeing things in strip form. And so you have a guy here who has died, and now he wants to make it all the way to King Osiris into the Egyptian afterlife. But he has to go through a series of portals, as it were, kind of like a video game where you have to go through a series to get to the next level. So you want to level up. And so how do you level up? Well, you have to know what to say and what to do at the appropriate juncture. And so this Book of the Dead would be often carved on the inside of your coffin, put on your tomb walls. You would have amulets and things to help remind you, because you needed to say the right password. You needed to do the right thing, or try to have something to kind of cover over your sin, to prevent the deities from seeing who you really were. So it's really a smoke and mirrors kind of thing to do sometimes. But they would be very moral. The Egyptians would go through what is called negative confessions. I have not committed adultery, I have not stolen, I have not lied. And that would be part of the original kind of acts that you would have to go through. And so what you see here is oftentimes you appear before kind of like a jury, and sometimes they're seen like holding a feather up or holding a feather down. It's kind of like the gladiator, you know, whether or not they give authorization for you to go to the next level. And so this guy finally comes to the end. And so what happens here is that here is Osiris, he's the king of the afterlife, but you have to make it through one last stage. And what we have here is a scale. I find it very fascinating because even today, a lot of people in a lot of religions think that there's good works and bad works. If your good works outweigh your bad works, well, then by golly, you'll make it in the afterlife. Well, it's kind of the same concept here, because you have a scale here, and if you don't make it in this part of the stage, this guy right here, this crocodile-like feature, is going to gobble you up. So he's there to kind of make sure that if you don't make it, he's ready to do his thing. But what happens here is you have things that are weighed. What's the things on the scale? On this side, you see a feather. Well, how heavy is a feather? Pretty light. The feather represents ma'at, which is the Egyptian word for justice. So justice is represented by a feather. But over here on this side, lost my thing. But on the other side of the scale is a jar. And in that jar is your heart. Now we see over here in the middle here, this gray, that's a heart amulet. And so this is something very important in Egyptian theology. The notion is if your heart is heavier than the feather, that crocodile guy is going to eat you up. Your heart has to be what? Lighter than the feather, or you're not going to make it. So that's Egyptian theology, folks. So now when we come to the Bible and we hear about Pharaoh, and again, there's all sorts of scholarly debate about who hardens Pharaoh's heart. Does God harden Pharaoh's heart, or does he harden his own heart? Well, it's a little bit of both. But whatever case you take a stand on that, Pharaoh is in trouble within his own theology. Why? Because if he has a hard heart at this journey, and it's heavier than the feather of justice, he's not going to make it. And so again, the world behind the text, the people I think would have had a little bit of understanding of this is how the Egyptians thought about how you make it in the afterlife. Far different, of course, than what the scriptures talk about, and that is what simple faith and what the Lord has done gives you eternal life. You don't have to worry about good works and bad works. All you have to do is trust, and that's the lesson that we learn from the scriptures. All right, we're going to move through. We're going to see some things that represent family life. These are not kids' toys. These will be buried with the rich in their tombs. Kind of be reanimated to serve them in the afterlife. Egyptians were very family-oriented. You can see here kids and families and kids playing leapfrog and toddlers doing their things, husband and wife standing lovingly arm in arm. So again, the Egyptians were very family-oriented. But we want to get over here to this part of the room. A couple things we see here, a game board, kind of like Chutes and Ladders and the Game of Life. You have a snake game board, but you have some die. Remember when the garment of Jesus was being gambled for at the foot of the cross? They cast lots to see which of the soldiers would get a piece of the garment. And so we see here, this is basically from the same time frame, the 1st century. We have pig knuckles. The soldiers are bored, stiff, while they're doing their guarding. So what are they doing? They're playing up and making up all sorts of games. One of the games is, I remember in high school, there was a game, pigs, pass the pigs. You know, little plastic pigs, and you gathered them in your hand, you threw them, and depending on if they landed on their snout or on their back or whatever position, you would get points. Well, that's kind of the same thing with pig knuckles, or knuckles of animal bones. Depending on which way they landed, upright or on their side or tilted or whatever else, you came up with some type of point system. And so soldiers are always looking for ways to lose money.
That's right.
You want to talk about the...
Oh, sure, yeah, this thing right in the middle that you're looking at is, if you're in Egypt and you want to tell time, you use a sundial, right? That tells you what time of day it is. What do you do at night? That's a water clock there. It's just a way of trying to mark time when you can't see the sun, so it's kind of interesting to see. But then back here, you see a brick made with straw. This is an Egyptian brick that would have been made to use, right, to construct their buildings and things like that, which certainly relate to the Exodus, right? This is what the children of Israel were making for Egypt, for the Egyptian pharaoh. And if you look closely at the top of it, you can see a stamp on the top that would have had the name of the pharaoh in the brick. This is who this brick is for. And just think of like what that would have been like if to be an Egyptian slave making this brick, and every brick that you make, the name of Pharaoh getting stamped on that, right? Who's this for? Who are you serving? As just representative of the oppression that the Israelites had. So it's kind of cool to be able to see that brick there. And I do want to give just a shout out. You guys can, we're going to wrap up here pretty quick, but feel free to stay and look in the museum, right? I mean, you can stay here as long as you want. Some of those little artifacts of Egyptian life are really great snippets into what daily life was like in ancient Egypt. They left those to be put in their tombs, but that's kind of fun to spend some more time and look at.
There's also, of course, musical instruments, so for musicians. There's also things like mirrors and combs and things related to cosmetics. So these are things. I just want to take a couple minutes in the Persian gallery, and then we'll wrap it up. But welcome to Persia. So this is, again, one of the major empires of the ancient world. And so Persia, of course, is modern-day Iran. Iran, believe it or not, is not Semitic. It is Indo-European. And that's why Iran and Iraq, actually, in the 70s and 80s, were at each other's throats because they were very different ethnically speaking. And so basically, Iran is basically Indo-European, and Iraq is Semitic. But I want to introduce you to Persepolis. Persepolis was a summer kind of capital for the Persian Empire. Susa was the main winter capital. So Susa is where the book of Esther takes place. But during the summer, during a time when the kings would receive tribute, they would come to Persepolis. Persepolis is this magnificently built, as one of the UNESCO kind of world treasures, the cities. And you can kind of see a little bit over here, again, reproduction of the video of what it looked like. But this is just one little part of this. This is called the Apadana, and it led up to several different rooms, a 100-column room and some other rooms where the king would receive dignitaries and people. But here's one guy standing over here. Just kind of let you see perspective of size. And this was all built by Persian craftsmen. This was not built by slave labor, like we think maybe the pyramids or other kind of monuments in the ancient world. So this is a love labor that the Persians give to their city, to their nation, to build this. And this was it's like summer fairgrounds. This was only used a couple weeks during the summer. This was up against the mountains. You can kind of see here. This is where you want to go. You want to go to Colorado in June, July, August, because it's so hot in some places. And that's what they would do. Susa would get a little bit too hot during the summer. And so you would go up to where the mountains were, and this is where Persepolis was. Now, of course, Persepolis was destroyed by Alexander the Great. You know a little bit about the Persian-Greek Wars. Persia was concerned about the up-and-coming Greek Empire and tried the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of 300, and the disaster that was public relations-wise for Persia and also militarily. And so the Greeks never forgave the Persians for what they did. And so when Alexander the Great and his army came through here, they basically burned Persepolis to the ground. And so, reminded. But one more thing, I want to introduce you to Esther's husband. That's Xerxes. Now, once again, he's got feathers, he's got legs of a bull, so he's a little different, but that's most likely his visage, his face. And so this would be something they would often do, is they would use the face of the king. This place, Persepolis, was built over a long period of time, and each king would add more and more renovation and more rooms to the Persepolis palace. But here we're probably most likely looking at what Xerxes, Esther's husband, would have looked like. All right.